For joining us. Thank you so much, Nick, for that. And thank you for all of you for being a part of our discussion tonight. We are intending to provide some opportunity for all of you to ask questions, hopefully get some answers near the end of our time together. And delighted and honored that you have chosen to spend some of your time on this summertime evening with us. As Nick said, it has been a pleasure for me to join Nick and other members of the professional staff and WAVE to be a part of our effort to make America safer. And a big part of that is to ensure that our gun laws and our gun policies and the ways in which we understand the role of firearms, as a Supreme Court justice recently said, in our daily lives, is based upon reason and rationality and ultimately focused on humanity, keeping us safe and secure when there are threats to that out there. And so, as Nick said, we thought that it would be appropriate, yes, indeed, to commemorate, to acknowledge the 250th anniversary of our nation by talking about some of that bifurcation in the aspiration for a safer and more secure nation, but also recognizing that we've got lots of challenges out there, lots of things we need to do in the 21st century and beyond. And we're hoping to have that discussion with you tonight about movements forward and also the other things that we need to do to ensure that the good work of WAVE continues in the days, the weeks, the months ahead. Again, delighted and honored to be with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Jim. And just for everyone on the call, we will have around 10 or so minutes at the end of our conversation for Q&A. So if you have any good questions, feel free to either put them in the chat at any point and we can refer back to them later, or save them and feel free to come off mute at a later point and ask those questions. So with that, I'll kick the conversation off. Jim, I think one of the words that gets used most often in the context of America and American history, and especially in the last few weeks around the 250th anniversary, is the word freedom. So kind of to get this conversation going, I want to ask you, are Americans more or less free today than we were 250 years ago?
I think it is the question of our time to do some self-analysis and also analysis as a community about where we are in America. And of course, like all the things that we think about when it comes to the history of our nation, there is no clear definitive answer. Yes or no, both of those fail in various ways. The reality is that we have had 250 years, actually a little bit more accurately, maybe 238, 239 years, depending upon how long you mark the Constitution of being in place. And that document also obviously intended to promote the good things that America is all about. And that includes freedom. And so the short answer is we have been in periods of greater and lesser freedom throughout our history. One of the things that I thought about as we prepared for today was the notion that even after the Revolutionary War that we have just acknowledged again as a part of the founding of our nation, right away, when our founding fathers were plainly, in the wake of that war, pleased to create this new nation, did also stumble along the way. And even the freedom that they seemed to embrace was also met by some setbacks. Recall from your history classes that very early on, when John Adams was the president, this thing called the Alien and Sedition Act. And it was actually 4 different pieces of legislation by the first Congress that imposed some significant restrictions on immigration and free speech. And an awful lot of people were very, very upset about that having come off a period of time when we presumably were shedding our shackles, if you will, and anticipating a nation of greater freedom, that the government turns right around and does that. And I use that as an example of the ways in which we take steps forward and take steps back as well. We recognize that even today, even after much of the Alien and Sedition Act was abandoned early on in our nation's history, that a portion of it remains in place. Even as late as 2025, 2026, the Alien Enemies Act continues to be a part of our language as we think about the ways that an administration is administering justice and trying to bring about some sense of freedom and encountering some great difficulties in when it comes to advancing what that is all about. And so the small answer to the question is a variety of different things, recognizing as well that there are 2 broad categories of things that can be a part of our answer. One is periods of time. And certainly that early time in our nation's history that we think about at this time is one of those. We recognize as well there are many other times in our nation's history. I think about the time, for example, right after the World Wars, World War I and World War II. Again, we celebrated, we commemorated the fact that we'd push back on those people who tried to rob us of freedom. And yet, in the wake of that, what did we do? In the midst of that, what did we do? We also did some things like we interned people and who are Japanese and German and even Italian descent on the notion that somehow they are threats to our nation. And so again, we have this mixed package, this mixed bag, if you will, of events by our government and yes, even by human beings. We recognize as well that even as late as recent years, we have had major movements forward in the areas of civil rights and the passage in the 1960s of those major pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Housing Act, all kinds of things that really seem to be times of greater freedom and greater opportunities for everybody in the American experience to be a part of this. But we also recognize that in recent times, many of those acts have been severely cut back by a Supreme Court that says no. Times have now passed. Our Chief Justice, among others, looks at least the Voting Rights Act and says those times are now a part of our past, and we no longer need to be as focused as we once needed to be on those kinds of fundamental issues. And so all of those, Nick, are examples from past, from the distant past, from the recent past, and even contemporary times when this arc which we think about of history moving forward, having greater freedom, greater incarnations, if you will, of what our Constitution says, or what the Declaration says, it is with stops and starts. And it prompts me to say in the end that in many ways, the references to the arc of freedom, which again, we all embrace and often said by people in the past, including Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of freedom always bends toward justice. I would sometimes say when we see those setbacks to say that sometimes that arc and sometimes our movement forward is sometimes cracked. And we do have severances in that arc. And then we try to mend those places where we've had those abrupt changes in our view. And so this arc of history includes improvements and movement forward, but also includes periods of time when we have setbacks. And that includes our present era. We are not beyond that. The other major category that I think about when I think about your question, are Americans more or free? We recognize that not only history is full of diversity, but for particular people and particular populations, the American experiment, which is wonderful and great, is still an experiment. And it has had a marginally and wildly dramatically different experiences for different people. People of color in this nation plainly have experienced something different than majority racial populations have. People of different economic statuses have had different experiences than have had those who have benefited from the economic largesse of our community. In terms of religion and faith, those areas have gone through periods of time that are different for different kinds of people, depending upon what your particular religion may be. People with abilities and disabilities, they too have had different experiences in the past and the present. And we also identify people with different orientations and identities, all those immutable characteristics that have been with us throughout time. And even in times of growth and movement forward, it is unfair, and it's probably just downright inaccurate to say those have always been times of movement forward for every segment of our population. We'd like to think that overall those cracks, when they happen, that we can mend them. But I think it's important to recognize early on, Nick, and all the rest of us, that the American experience has been different for all kinds of people. And we certainly here at WAVE recognize that as we think about inside, again, those historically different periods of time and the ways in which our populations have experienced America differently, one of the things that we can do to address those cracks, those things that need mending, is to ensure that we are at least moving toward a time of greater safety and security. And that's the reason why WAVE, among other groups, and especially those of you who are with us tonight and joining with us in this great mission, need to be continued to ensure that one of the ways in which freedom over history, all kinds of different periods, freedom for all kinds of different peoples can and should be advanced and promoted by ensuring that we are safe, not just in our homes, and that certainly is the ultimate place of privacy in America. We know that well. That's the ultimate spot where the Congress and the Supreme Court and even the executive branch have said we've got that privacy and that freedom, but also out there in the community. And this notion, once again, that we have rights, and one of those rights we advocate for tonight and today, and WAVE does every single day, is to this notion that we've got a right to safety and security. And that is one of the most important things that I think can animate our references to history and our references to the different experiences that people in our history have had over long periods of time.
Jim, I think that really, really hits the sort of the theme of this entire discussion on the head, right? Which is also summed up very well by Pastor Scott's message that he put in the chat a little while back about how the 4th of July is different, and the meaning of freedom has been, or not so much the meaning, but the experience of the American history has been different for different people. And I think it's true too that gun violence has impacted different people differently. And we know that today, in America, Black and brown individuals are far more likely to be victims of gun violence than white people. And WAVE actually just released a report this week about the incredibly high rates of homicide within and victimization within the Black communities in Wisconsin. We are one of the states that struggles the most with these inequities, and it's something that WAVE is always trying to address and fix through policy and education. Jim, can you talk a little bit more about kind of how we've gotten to where we are? I know that, as you said, it's been a series of steps in the right direction with progress, and there have also been setbacks. But if you could talk towards that a little bit more and the role of GVP kind of in that.
Absolutely. And again, we go back to a history that, again, we celebrate, as we do, the creation of our nation here, and acknowledge that our founding fathers put in place many things that we still hold dear. We recognize as well, not only that there have been different experiences for different people, but in what is perhaps one of the most dramatic, if not the most dramatic way in which our nation was tested, we have a civil war right in the middle of the 19th century. And that is not only a time to reckon with who we are, but we recognize as well.
It was 2.5 minutes on 7, but I don't know if that was too long.
And we recognize that the Civil War itself was an attempt to do some reckoning with what our nation is all about, and ultimately to correct, frankly, what began as this great experiment, the incorporation in our Constitution of slavery as we know it was, and again correcting that and correcting the horrors of slavery, again imperfectly once again, a crack in our history, and trying to mend it ever since that time. And so once again, that notion that we have a history that is uniform in movement forward, certainly there is support for that, but also an awful lot of indication that we've had our times of great crisis. And those are, it's not just the Civil War, but also times plainly in the 1960s. And once again, we reference not only the ways in which Americans experience our liberties and our freedoms differently, but also try to do things to try to remedy that as well. When we think about recently the work to address guns in America and provide more safety and security, recognize too that it was not until 2008, about again 18 years or so ago, that our country and through the Supreme Court recognized for the first time, in a case we'll chat about at the end of our time together here, that there's an individual constitutional right to firearms possession in the home for self-defensive purposes, increased a number of years later to out there in the streets. That too represents a significant change in who we are as a nation. And yet embedded in that, as we'll talk about later on, is this notion that once again, no right that is out there that has its limitations, and that includes those decisions by the Supreme Court. I regard the passage of time in the history of our nation as very much one in which we do, as the Declaration of Independence said, as our Constitution says, this notion once again of promoting the general welfare, That's the Constitution, of course, the common defense, domestic tranquility, establishing justice. All of those things in our founding documents cannot be accomplished absent safety and security in our homes, but also out there on the streets. The blessings of liberty, the benefits of welfare, the general welfare, once again, and the establishment of a constitution to promote all of that. That's really what's at the founding of focus of not only Wade, but all of us who are committed to a safer and more secure community. That language about tranquility and the general welfare, the common defense, all those things, the blessings of freedom, the blessings of liberty. You can't have any of that unless you've got people in places of responsibility who are willing to embrace that and act on that every single day. And that means, as Wade does on a routine basis, advocating for legislation that does make us more safe and secure. We'll talk about the ways in which those can be accomplished, but also doing an awful lot to inform the public. And that's a key portion of the WAVE Educational Fund mission as well, which is to ensure that people understand this history and how we as Americans fit into that, and people who are advocating for a safer and more secure environment, and yes, rational and reasonable and balanced gun legislation. We are patriots. We are patriots, and we love our country and want to make certain that it is advanced well into the 22nd and 23rd centuries down the road there. And it's because of that sense of wanting to focus on the general welfare in the future that we do what we do. Again, progress, absolutely, but also those setbacks and the need to consistently mend that when that happens.
Jim, you're touching on a point that I think is really important, which is the role of activists in the progression of what freedom means in this country. I think it's fair to say that everybody who joins this call is an activist, and in this sense, they're an activist for gun violence prevention. But I know some of the other folks who are on here are activists for any number of different causes. But what role would you say activists have played in making people more free in the past 250 years?
You can look to so many advocacies, again, historically and certainly recently, where people say, you know what, I don't like what my government is doing, or I do like what my government is doing, and let them know about that as well. The changes in our history, all these changes, frankly, again, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s in areas of housing and accommodation and employment and voting, all those kinds of things, they came about ultimately. Yes, indeed. Legislators that we did send to the Congress and people we put in the White House and on the Supreme Court embrace those kinds of things. But where do all those concepts come from? They come from, we can call them activists. I would also say that they too are patriots, even in their criticism of America and the notion that we can do better. The notion that people are simply ones who are the recipients of legislative actions, and it just all goes in that direction. Just the opposite. We're the ones who animate what Congress can and should do. And the movements, again, toward greater freedom, greater sense of safety and security, all that gets accomplished when quite literally we do what the First Amendment says we should do. Peaceably assemble. Get out there, petition government for the redress of grievances. There's a reason why that's in the First Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1789 by the first Congress. It is because of this recognition by the very people who wrote the Declaration, wrote the Constitution, that none of this is going to work unless we hear voices, unless we hear from people, unless there is a redress of grievances, and yes, a push toward better America by people who are out there. We have certainly seen that recently in our history, just in the past couple of years, but that has always been the case. And again, I hearken yet again to the time of the 1960s, and certainly in the 1970s and other times in our nation's history before and since that time, when people have looked at the news and said, I do not like what's going on. In many ways, we know well that in the 1960s, too, the eventual decision by our leaders to pull back on the Vietnam War was a reaction to the fact that Americans looked at that and said, we can no longer justify that. It is people who are activists who look at the world around them and say we can do better than that. And that's exactly what all of you are doing every time that you join us for one of our lobby days, join us for events in cities and communities throughout the state of Wisconsin and beyond, who call and make informational pieces to people around the state and beyond. Every single time we do that, we're activists. And again, I want to emphasize this notion that activism and that redress of needs to do better is the perfect embodiment of patriotism and patriots who love our country. And those are not inconsistent. They're actually the same kind of thing. And so a strong encouragement to do those positive things. And the lessons that we have learned recently in the gun violence protection efforts, both in the federal government, we've talked about some of those in the past. They're halting, admittedly, and yes, there are sometimes disappointments, but we also know that those things can move forward. We know two other things, and that is in Wisconsin, we've had this issue of progressive movement. Wisconsin has been known historically as a progressive state, meaning that we do, in fact, remedy things as patriots when we think that they're wrong. And we also recognize at the same time that all of this takes time and we need patience. And that's not to say we need to be complacent or we need to sit back, but just recognizing that when we do not in the moment achieve success, we recognize that we live for another day and we plan for that next day, and that it is over that long arc, broken from times, that will also be repaired, that time can also see these greater movements forward. That's what activists are all about: identifying the problem, identifying the issue, being out there, informing the public, moving government, moving populations of people who need to support all of that, and recognizing that discouragement sometimes is a part of this too, because we'll get encouraged in days coming and inspired by the ways in which we can, in fact, and have been successful in many areas, including gun violence protection.
You know, I love how you talk about sort of the spirit of an activist in knowing that even when times get dark, it's sort of our guiding light that we're going to try to push for something different. And I know that everyone on this call is familiar with how dire our situation can be at times with the gun laws here in Wisconsin. And we see, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people dying from gun violence every year. It's a leading cause of death for kids in the state. And I know we'll talk a little bit later about some of the opportunities on the horizon that we're really thinking might turn this around. But before we get into that, I do want to ask you, Jim, to kind of touch on the history of the Second Amendment and the case law from the founding until the present day, up until even just 2 weeks ago when a recent Second Amendment case came down from this court. So if you could walk us through that history, I think that would be helpful.
Right. Absolutely, Nick. I will do just that. And as an introduction to that, and as addendum to the good words that Nick just articulated for us, I also believe that all of this, and I think about these cases, and I note, as we often do, that they're all brought by individual people, right? None of them just springs from the mind of a Supreme Court justice or others in the judicial field. They're all premised upon individuals doing things. And so the addendum that I would make to our conversation that Nick and I have just had about advocacy and patriotism when it comes to activists is that you can have an impact even in that singular conversation. Yes, indeed, with a legislator, or if you get the opportunity, obviously, not without some sense of the process here, but even with a judge or other people in the community, members of a county board, members of a common council. Those individual contacts, those are huge. And that's where you build on some of the things that we're all about with WAVE and beyond. And so that's exactly what we continue to digest when we think about these Supreme Court cases. I'd just like to note, Nick, at the outset of all of this, that for most of our history, and yes, indeed, I know that there are people who would push back on what I'm about to describe as the history of our founding fathers. But I think it's important to note that until June 26th of 2008, in this country, our notion was not that there was a constitutionally recognized individual right to gun ownership. And we'll get to that in just a moment or so. And indeed, this language of the Second Amendment, which again is a little bit circuitous. We probably wouldn't write it that way if we did, but talking about this notion of relying upon, again, groups of people to defend our nation. That's what this was all about way back in 1789. James Madison putting this together, and principally it was intended to prevent a federal tyranny. They were very concerned about the government, which they had just thrown off, and the king. They were very concerned about the government, at number one, creating a new army. And believe it or not, our founding fathers were concerned about that. And a standing army. They were concerned about a federal tyranny that they had just gotten rid of. And so that's the reason why that they again passed and did in fact follow this Second Amendment language that talked about an armed populace as opposed to a standing army. And it was influenced heavily by this notion of a Revolutionary War, their experiences there, earlier state constitutions and that as well. They feared a powerful central government with a strong military that might oppress the citizens. And that was the focus of that language. And the reason why you get the language there in the Second Amendment is because then you have the individuals who can defend themselves best against that domestic oppression that could come, and also foreign invasion. That was their concept between talking about the basic trappings of the Second Amendment. Obviously, also prompted by interest in personal protection that was there, animal hunting, practical physical challenges of a frontier living, a growing nation, all that kind of thing. And again, a very different view, and a very different view than the one that was articulated by a fellow named Antonin Scalia in 2008. He went back and looked at that same history. And he said that what Jim Santelle just described to you right now is at least somewhat misleading. He said it's just the opposite almost, and that it did in fact intend to establish the right of an individual to keep and bear arms not related to militia service for traditional law enforcement purposes like self-defense and a residence. And that was the case of District of Columbia versus Heller, an attempt for the first time to push back on legislation by the District of Columbia to rein in and to address safety and security issues there in the District of Columbia. And I am always, as those who have heard me talk, as is way routinely, I'm always the first one to say that Heller, while yes, and it's changed the ways when we think about the Second Amendment, also went on to say very important language coming from Antonin Scalia, and it's what animates Wave and all of us to this day. The opinion made clear that even while it's establishing for the first time this notion of this newly found constitutional right, it's not unlimited and it's conditional. And it does not extend to all weapons in all places and all times under all circumstances. Scalia goes on to say that you can restrict things like concealed weapons and possession by felons or mentally ill people, carrying guns in sensitive places like schools and government buildings, public places, and most significant limitations on the conditions and qualifications for sale and transfer, all those kinds of things, the trappings of how we think about guns today. That was 2008. And that too is Heller. And so it's important to recognize that while there's a big change in our understanding of the Second Amendment on June 26th of 2008, that very same Supreme Court case, frankly, gave to the founders like Jerry Bonavia and others of Wave the impetus to say we can do these things and we can yes, pass reasonable, rational restrictions on this right. No right in America is unconditional, and that includes the Second Amendment. We jump many years to 2022, a major case called Bruin, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. You know the case. This case, 6-3 vote. Heller, for what it's worth, is a 5-4 vote. The court finding in that case that New York law requiring that applicants to carry a concealed pistol show proper cause or some special need to do so, and that you submit a form, a request of the government, of the state, to carry that, but only by identifying the specific need that you have. Supreme Court finding that request, that petition process, is an unconstitutional infringement on the Second Amendment right announced in Heller, and goes on to do two things, specifically that expands Heller beyond the right of self-defense in a private home to public venues, goes beyond the House, but also requires, very important as we think about more recent cases, that in evaluating the constitutionality of all this legislation, placing appropriate, reasonable, rational conditions on the right of gun ownership, courts have to look to what the court said at that time is a historical tradition of firearm regulation. Look back into history and find and apply some past restrictions that could in fact be invoked for contemporary circumstances. And even as I say that out loud, it's called the Bruin test. Even as I say that out loud, the point of all of that is that in assessing the validity of limitations that are described in Heller, the Supreme Court says you got to look back in history. And I would offer the opinion here that that rule, which is again increasingly coming under attack, is not embracing the notion of a living constitution. And I think many of us who think about contemporary America, as Nick and I did in our first back and forth here, we think about a country that is living. We don't look to the past. We understand the past. We're animated by the past. We know our history, but we also have to do things based upon what the present is. And sure enough, we have a case in 2024 called Rahimi, in which the court says, you know what? That Bruin test can't give us the answers to everything. By a vote to 8-1, the court concluded that the Second Amendment does not prevent the federal government from prohibiting a person from possessing a firearm who's suffering under a court-ordered restraining order relating to domestic violence. And it seemingly begins to suggest that that Bruin test may not be as strong as it should be, and that in fact that courts in addressing these limitations should compare modern restrictions, yes, to history, but also through similar analogies, and not to exact twins, as they said, but general propositions, general principles, and not strict mandates. We've got a case just in the last term called Vanderstock, same kind of thing. The Supreme Court says, yes, indeed, a 7-2 vote that even under Bruin, the government can in fact impose laws to limit the sale of ghost guns in such a way that those weapons kits can be controlled under the Gun Control Act of 1968 to ensure that manufacturers and sellers obtain licenses and mark their products with serial numbers and conduct background checks, even for those ghost gun components, again, indicating that gun rights in America are conditioned. And that's once again what WAVE is all about. A couple of recent cases that Nick has already talked about a little bit, at least made reference to. Both of them I would offer not nearly as significant as what is probably coming in the next term. Case decided just on June 18th of this year, called Ali Hamani, the defendant charged for conviction of unlawful possession of a firearm based on his regular use of marijuana, which is prohibited by what's called Section 922 of the United States Code. The court invokes Heller and New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. Unanimous court says this is not the kind of person who is prevented from carrying a weapon, fairly limited. And the court says we appreciate that drugs and guns do not mix, they do not come together well, but also noting that the opinion there is very narrow and does not limit the enforcement of the law and does not prevent efforts to ban addicts or those who are presently intoxicated from possessing firearms. All those reasonable things that we do on a regular basis does not prevent prosecution when drug use is deemed to be a danger to a user or others, or upon some proof, as Neil Gorsuch says, that certain types of drugs always render users dangerous. And there's a big one called Walford versus Lopez. This is just a couple of weeks ago, June 25th. In response to Bruin, as you know well, Hawaii, one of the strictest states when it comes to using that language in Heller to impose restrictions and conditions on gun use and transfer and possession, basically says that there is a ban there on weapons in so-called sensitive places, again, like schools and parks and privately owned areas like gas stations and shopping malls where the public is invited on. And there is a requirement there for explicit permission under the Hawaiian law from property owners before you can carry your weapons onto those private properties otherwise open to the public. This is the case in Lopez. Plaintiffs arguing that no carry limitation, again, infringes our Second Amendment rights. Defendants contend, including the state of Illinois, that the law protects private property rights and also is consistent with all those other cases, including the proper limitations on the right to own weapons, especially on premises that are private in nature, in which the public is invited on. A 623 order, Sam Alito writes that the state law violates the constitutional right to bear arms, and troublingly writes, from my perspective, that the right of Americans to carry arms for self-defense is there as they go about their daily lives. And this harkens back, from my perspective, to what Nick and I were talking about before, this notion that we need to be thoughtful about who we are today. Yes, indeed, Supreme Court, thinking about our daily lives, but understanding that those lives have got to be promoted through safety and security. And absent that, we do not have a truly free society. We've got a strong dissent, again, by Ketanji Brown Jackson and Elena Kagan, written by Sonia Sotomayor. It says the objective of the majority there is protecting guns, not consistently preserving any principle of law, and goes on to say that Hawaii is, in fact, consistent with Bruin test. This is a state that has traditionally adopted this notion that, yes, you've got a right to gun ownership, but there can be restrictions. Why? Because we live in a society of people. We need to be safe and secure. And so that's Wolford versus Lopez. Neither one of those cases, from my perspective, because it doesn't prevent, by the way, companies and private locations from posting those signs that say, we're not giving you permission to bring guns onto these properties, that we see all those times. Nothing about Wolford prevents that from happening. It's just this explicit permission that effectively is rescinded by those laws. When we think about what the Supreme Court is doing in the near future here, then we also look to the coming term, which, yes, begins in early October. We're still in the 2025-2026 term. And one of the things that has just been recently announced at the same time as these recent cases, in a couple of cases called Viramontes versus Cook County, one of the cases coming out of a region just to the south of us here in Wisconsin and Illinois, another one called Grant versus Higgins. This one comes out of the state of Connecticut. State of Connecticut, of course, we know that's where Newtown happened and where the disastrous situation there of Sandy Hook and the catastrophic, disastrous sacrifice of human lives, including some very young lives, is there as well. In both of those jurisdictions, what the legislatures, what the leaders do is they say, you know what, we're going to ban these assault type weapons, AR-15 type weapons, because again, we can do so under Heller. These are not weapons of the sort that can be embraced for defensive purposes. These are something quite different. A huge amount of legislative history describing the reason for banning those weapons, which again, federally, we did many years ago in the 1990s with results that meant fewer gun violence deaths, fewer of these kinds of catastrophic things that we see in places like Connecticut and other spots around the nation. And so these two jurisdictions come along and say, we're going to ban these weapons outright as a way, once again, of making ourselves more safe and more secure. The Supreme Court has identified, again, these two cases. They'll move in tandem through the process, the system here, as ones that they're going to review under Heller and under Bruin and under those recent cases, even from this past court. Advocates, of course, have written that these guns are used for hunting and target shooting and self-defense. Others, again, opponents of them say no. They're used not for those kinds of purposes, but because manufacturers are flooding the market, and that they're weapons of choice for criminals who are set on massacres. And that's what we've seen in so many places around America. Innocents, they say, rarely put to lawful public use by the use of these weapons of war. Having spent some time in Iraq myself and seeing these weapons in use, I can tell you, again, I was not on the battlefield, but saw those in Baghdad and other places. That's their purpose. Hopeful very much that the advocacy that comes from reasonable and rational approaches to these things takes hold in the Supreme Court, and that we get a majority, as we saw, again, in cases like Rahimi and Vanderstock and others in the past, that say we've got to be rational and reasonable about these things, and that the semi-automatic weapons should not be a part of our daily lives in America. That is a very brief summary, Nick, and plainly an awful lot to build on, including a question now that I have for you. And that is, what kinds of things can we anticipate WAVE doing now in the future to make us more safe and secure in the coming legislative sessions, to make that language that we talked about in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, more real for us here in Wisconsin and throughout our great nation?
Well, first thing, I have to get unmuted. I appreciate the question, Jim, and I just want to say, I've said this too many times, and I'm sure other people have heard me say it, but listening to you educate on case law reminds me of law school in the best possible way. I was a nerd, still am a nerd in law school, and really enjoyed learning about Supreme Court cases and I know we've got, not to put her on the spot, just gonna say we have an intern here, Emily, who wants to go to law school. This is the kind of thing that hopefully is interesting to you and you can look forward to. Really quickly, because I want to open it up to questions. I just want to say that for as uh, to put it lightly, dire and incredibly frustrating the situation has been here in Wisconsin, where we have been unable to even pass local laws due to preemption and unable to garner majority support for the most basic of life-saving policies in the state capitol. It has been decades of inaction, or even worse, policies being put forward that would actively make us less safe. But I think for those of you that have been following the uh, political possibilities, if you will, and following the news, we really do feel here at Wave that this upcoming session has a chance to be one of the first in a long, long time where we can really start to pass some policies that will make our state much safer. Um, a few of us at Wave just got out of a meeting earlier this week in the Capitol with legislative leaders, uh, kind of planning out next steps and ensuring that policies like universal background checks and extreme risk laws and closing our domestic violence loophole that exists here in Wisconsin will be a week one, day one priority for the leaders in the legislature. So we can't do any of that without everyone on here, and we will continue to call on you all to show up and be active and share your heartfelt concern and wisdom. But I truly do feel like we have opportunities coming up that we haven't had in a long time, and I think that we'll be able to ensure that the freedom to live safe in Wisconsin is protected. With that, I want to open it up to anyone to come off mute or raise your hand, and we can do a period of Q&A.